most of you are aspiring to be a science communicator of some denomination or another. You're going to be maybe a college professor, you're going to be maybe in policy work. Some of you aspire to be science journalists professionally. In any of these contexts, you are going to be communicating scientific ideas to non-scientific audiences. You're not just talking to your colleagues. That's kind of what we're here to talk about today. And that's not an easy task. On the other hand, this is a great time to be interested in science communication because over the last, I'd say, 15 years in round numbers, you could extend it, there has been a tremendous amount of research on science communication, best practices, some of the psychological underpinnings of what makes for effective communication and so forth. Both AAAS and the National Academy of Sciences have been taking science communication very seriously, and both of them provide, I think, very useful resources. The Academy's Science of Science Communication series is, I think, very useful. There's 3 of these now. They've had 3 separate conferences, and at least the first 2 Science of Science Communication proceedings and videos are online. Everything from the Academy is free, so you can just log in and download the stuff or watch it or read the abstracts. I think a lot of good work was done in these conferences. They really brought together a lot of very good people who are doing cutting-edge research and are very, it was a combination of researchers and practitioners for most of these. They were quite good experiences, I think. If you just Google Sackler, Science of Science Communication, you'll be able to find it. I don't think the Academy has a really great website. It's kind of opaque, but if you Google, you can get into it. Their most recent publication in these matters is the Communicating Science Effectively, a slim volume, which you can download for free or pay $40 for if you want it in hard copy. This is really a summary of research on science communication. I think this is also very well worthwhile. All right, communication. Generally agreed upon to consist of a communicator who communicates to an audience. Now, the audience isn't passive. The audience often communicates back, and the audience doesn't always get what you think the audience is going to get. This is one of the great disappointments of science communication. But the channel of communication is also important. Is it verbal? Is it auditory? Is it tactile? Is it visual? Is it some combination of that? And what is the medium of the communication channel? Is it a text? Is it a blog post? Is it a podcast? Is it the boring sage on the stage, which I'm doing right now, which is the do what I say, not what I do. This is the worst way of getting information out to people, but it's the one that I'm fairly good at, and that's just what I'm going to do today. There's a lot of not just communication theory, but also learning theory that says that merely lecturing at people is probably the worst way of transmitting information. When you think about it, the printing press made the lecture obsolete. This is why Gutenberg was so important, but I digress. Been known to happen. Those 3 components, though, the communicator, the communication channel, and the audience, that's not the end of the story, because all communication takes place in a social context. Both the scientist and the audience reflect this social context. Now, as individuals, we clearly have our own opinions, we have our politics, we have our social identities, and so on. We also use language peculiar to science that is not always understood in the same way. I'll have a few more comments to make about that a little bit later on. And similarly, the audience also reflects the social context. The audience doesn't just sit there passively observing the science that we shovel forth. There's a real problem, I think, particularly with college professors, who believe that if students don't understand the material, it's their fault. that's rarely the case. Too often, what is the case is a model of communication, a model of learning called the science deficit model, which suggests that all you really need to do is just shovel in the science. Open up the head and put in as much science as you can, and the person will then walk out. Now I know everything. Doesn't really work that way. It doesn't really work that way. The science deficit model has been shown for a number of years that this does not fit the facts. And this is particularly true when the subject matter that you're trying to communicate is in the slightest bit controversial. At the National Center for Science Education, you might have gathered from looking at some of the books in this library, we deal with evolution and climate change. We're for them. Well, we're not for them, but we support the teaching of these subjects, okay? The problem is that an awful lot of people in the United States don't want their kids learning either evolution. Another bunch doesn't want them learning climate change. There's the intersection of some points, but generally it's two separate groups of people who don't like these two subject areas. And, teachers get a lot of pushback. So one of the major functions of NCSE is to try to give teachers the tools for how to stand up for good science, so to speak. We've done a lot of thinking over the years at NCSE of how to communicate information about controversial subjects. And of course, one of the things that we learned very, very early in the game is that you don't just throw more science on it. If somebody is rejects evolution, if somebody is a religious creationist, just telling them more about the Cambrian explosion is not going to persuade them that evolution is really okay. So the context in which the communication occurs is very important. Let me just give you one quick example of that. Now, the Yale University researcher Daniel Kahan and his team have researched a number of factors on the perception of risk, the acceptance of information, changing of opinions, and so forth. And I'm just going to talk about one little article that they did, which I think you'll find kind of interesting. In this article that came out in Behavioral Public Policy, they first tested a sample of American adults. Now, try not to read the abstract, okay? This is the problem. This is the problem with putting placeholder slides up there to smart people, because all of you you're all squinting and getting eye strain so that you can read this because you're all compulsive readers. Just pretend that is just ipsum locator. This is just a prop, okay? Just to show you that there really is an article there. The important thing, of course, is the reference if anybody wants the reference. But just look at Dan's smiley face. He doesn't always look like that, so it's a really nice picture of Dan. But don't read the abstract. I'll tell you everything you need to know, and it's one of the things about PowerPoint. Your audience can either be readers or listeners. It is cognitively impossible for you to read and listen at the same time. This is not multitasking. There's no such thing as multitasking. You're switching tasks when you think you're multitasking. Similarly with listening and reading. So if you want, this is why I have very little text on my slides, because if you put a whole bunch of text up there, your audience is going to start reading the text and they're not listening to you. You want to listen to me. You want your audiences to listen to you because you are the talk, not what's on the slide. I drive people nuts because they say, would you please post your talk? Sure, I'll post the talk, and they see the talk and they have no idea what it's about because I don't put the damn talk on the slide. You read the notes. There's all sorts of good stuff down here in the notes. I'll give Tucker this presentation. If anybody wants to steal pieces from it, that'll be fine. But you'll notice that all the important stuff.
Will you post the notes?
The notes will be part of it because the notes are at the bottom of the slide. I will not erase the notes. That would be really what a rotten trick. Okay, what they did is they took a sample of adult Americans and they gave them a little numeracy evaluation. And of course, they found a quite wide range, actually somewhat truncated toward the low numeracy end of things. But they, some people were better at numbers than other people, better at numbers, fine. And they also did some tests on their political affiliations. Or, do you support these views or those views? And from that, they were able to categorize them as liberal or conservative. So they asked the people to evaluate a study of the efficacy of a cream for treating rashes. And they gave them this 2x2 table where some people got the skin cream and some people didn't, and some got better and some didn't. Okay, just a basic 2x2 table. And they had to decide whether using the skin cream is more likely to make the rash get better or worse. Okay, very typical, sort of thing that you'd hope most citizens can do. Just read a little table in the newspaper. Then they changed the headers of the columns so that for part of the sample, the correct answer was that the rash got better, and for another part of the sample, the correct answer was that the rash got worse with the cream. But the numbers were the same in the cells. Okay, so you're not really testing here for your ability to do arithmetic. They had sneaky things in mind here. And of course, what they found is that the people who scored higher in numeracy got the right answer more frequently. That was not a big surprise. And then they had a little bit more fun. They changed it up a bit, and using the same numbers that they had in the skin cream example, asked the subjects whether gun control has a positive or negative effect on crime. Okay? If you ban concealed weapons, does this increase or decrease crime? And as with the hand cream, they jiggered the numbers. The numbers were the same. They jiggered the column headings so that part of the sample got a correct answer of C, that the crime decreases, and the other part of the sample got a correct answer that the crime increases. But the numbers are the same for all treatments, so it's not really a test of arithmetic, right? Now, you would predict that the people who are better at math are going to do better on this test than the people who are not good at math, just like with the skin cream example. Because numbers are numbers, and if they know how to do it, they know how to do it. And then they tossed in political affiliation. The blue is Democrat, the red is Republican. Now, remember that the rash increases or the rash decreases are both correct answers, depending on what the column, depending on what example you got from in the quiz. And as in the general population results, the more numerate did better than the less numerate. Party affiliation didn't make any difference. The red lines and the blue lines are pretty similar. But it's rather different for the gun control example. So when Democrats were, I'm trying to see what I have, when Democrats answered correctly that time decreases, they did a whole lot better. Democrats largely believe that crime decreases when guns are restricted, and when that's the correct answer, they're more likely to get it right. And when crime increases is the right answer, they're more likely to get it wrong, which fits with their ideology. Now, similarly, Republicans are more likely to get it correct that crime increases when you restrict guns, and less likely to get it right when the right answer is crime decreases, which, of course, is ideologically less attractive. And notice that having greater numeracy doesn't make you more likely to get it right. What's happening is that their political ideology is overriding their ability to do this fairly empirical, mathematical challenge here. Whereas with the skin cream example, it didn't make any difference. You toss in something that they've got, a horse in that race, so to speak, they don't perform as well. The takeaway here is you can't just pour science into the brains like Calvin and Hobbes. You've got to take into consideration the context in which the discussion takes place. Now, there's a lot of concepts floating around in the literature: cultural cognition, motivated reasoning, motivated cognition, confirmation bias, disconfirmation bias, identity protective cognition. They go on and on. We're not going to go through the distinctions among them. There's an awful lot of overlap. For our purposes today, what really counts is that all of these concepts that have shown up in the literature really refer to filtering, as it were, filtering empirical information through an ideology or values or identification filter. Now, ideologies, of course, are the isms that everybody has. Feminism, environmentalism, libertarianism, creationism. Everybody has isms. They are the views around which we organize our life. Ideologies are not evil. I mean, everybody has them. Some of us are very proud of our ideologies. Our ideologies reflect our values. And our ideologies and values form the core of our identification with social groups, with our tribes, if you will. The people that we consider important to us, and the people with whom we identify and want to remain close and respected. If a coal miner's identity as a third-generation coal miner in a community in which coal miners in Appalachia are respected people, if you threaten that identity by saying that we have to get off fossil fuels and we have to close down the mine, how likely, is that idea? We have to close down the mine because CO2 is warming gas and the planet's getting warmer. That is not going to be a perspective that's going to be adopted or accepted with very much enthusiasm. Our identification, our cultural identity, our social identity is very important in the way we process information. And this is true of just about everybody. In any regard, the science deficit model of just pouring science into someone's brain is not going to do the job. There's a lot of considerations when it comes to successfully communicating science. Now, I spent a rather long time running this nonprofit science education organization. We dealt with controversial issues. So I've actually had to do a lot of interviews with the press, and since many of you aspire to or might even become science journalists, I thought I would focus on dealing with the press in my formal remarks today. Obviously, when I shut off this machine and quit being the sage on the stage, there we go. We can talk about anything you want, and if I know anything about it, I'll tell you. If I don't, we'll talk about something else. But I thought I would talk about communicating with the press, because that seems like a halfway useful thing to do. I'm actually not going to talk about the really obvious things that you probably already know about. You have a simple, clear message, repeat it frequently. I mean, that kind of stuff you probably already know, or you're learning how to, you know it intellectually, you're learning how to do it. By the way, these little radio shows that he's talking about, where you don't have very much of an audience, it's a great place to practice. Because if you screw up, it doesn't matter a whole lot. It's not like 400,000 people are listening to you on that radio station. So take advantage of all opportunities like this that you can, because it's really a good idea. And you'll make mistakes. Boy, did I make a lot of mistakes when I was starting out. I still make mistakes. At NCSC, we had an expression we used a whole lot. We're educating a parade. What we would have to say the same thing, because here's a new part of the parade that's come along, and they haven't heard that important thing. Very, very different from academia. In academia, you wouldn't be caught dead giving the same talk twice at in your professional conferences. That's just a no-no. On the other hand, in science communication, once you get a really good way of talking about the Cambrian explosion, do it a little bit better next time, but if it works, say the same thing, because it's a new part of the parade that's coming through. And don't ever feel bad about repeating yourself, because you're educating. I'm not going to talk about the importance of using analogies and metaphors, because you probably already know about that as well. I do want to mention some things that maybe you haven't thought about, or even if you have thought about them, maybe I can give you some ideas for how to deal with them. So, what's the press all about? Well, I once attended a conference. I was asked to speak at a conference of science reporters, the National NSWA, National Science Writers Association. Really a good organization. You should consider joining it you are serious about being a science communicator, because the National Science Writers Association has the best conferences ever. And they're also really a great bunch of people. But this was a wonderful conference because, of course, they were talking to each other, so they kind of let their hair down. And one of the New York Times reporters mentioned that there are only 4 science stories in journalism. It's going to kill you. It's going to cure you. Mad scientist. Bad scientist. And anything having to do with abortion or religion, so this reporter in a Quebec newspaper must have felt he really hit the jackpot at that point. So downhill from there. Okay, now obviously this is a joke that science journalists tell among themselves, but there's an awful lot of science stories that would fall into one of these 5 categories. But more important than the topics that tend to show up in science journalism is the culture of the press. What are the values that members of the press have, and how does that influence how they go about doing their work and their interaction with you? And if you understand a little bit about media values, then you can use them to your advantage, so to speak, and you'll have a better opportunity communicating with the press. So what do members of the media value? Well, these 4 elements, independence, accuracy, narrative, and balance, clearly they overlap. And, if we're going to be completely honest, they're aspirational. Not every reporter, not every member of the press is able to be fully independent, fully accurate, always deal with narrative and always produce. No, these are aspirational goals, but they're very good ones. They're very solid goals, and they're very worthwhile goals, even if all reporters don't always live up to them. Let's talk about independence. Now, the neat thing about the First Amendment is that it calls for separation of not just religion and government, but also for government and the press. The press wants its independence from the government, and my goodness, anybody who's not been hiding under a rock for the last 12 months understands why this is such an incredibly important value in the American constitutional system. But journalists also want to be independent of you. They don't want you telling them how to write their story. I think you're all probably smart enough not to do that. They also don't even particularly want you shaping their story, but often it's a very good thing for you to try to shape the story so that it comes out better to meet your goals, which of course are communicating accurate science to the public. In my case at NCSE, I had a number of other goals in addition to just, having just the joy of science and having more of our fellow citizens understand evolution or climate change and what a wonderful thing science is. We also had some goals of trying to ensure that evolution continued to be taught in school districts where it was being taught, or that it wasn't shut down. We had to monitor school boards at the local level and at the state level, and state legislatures, which are continually passing these or attempting to pass laws that would screw up the teaching of science. So in many cases we wanted to shape a story when we were being interviewed by, say, the newspaper or television. We would try to shape it so that our position was front and center. I'll talk a little bit about some of the storylines that reporters often like to push, which are not necessarily inimical to our achieving our goals, but which often get in the way and steering around us. And I'll give you an example from my own personal history. Many years ago, I was approached by the BBC, which wanted to make a radio program about the creation and evolution controversy. And Martin Redfern was the fellow who was in charge of this project. And we had a number of telephone conversations. Martin's become a friend. He's a good guy. But his first pitch was that he would do this 3-part radio, 3 hours. That's a hell of a long program. Only the BBC and only NPR does stuff like that. It's so great. Just as an aside, the worst thing ever is commercial television. You get such a short little bite of time to talk, you really have to have all your ducks in a row and be really specific and really precise if you're going to get your message out. Because they have to cut to a commercial in 25 seconds, and the person who's interviewing you has a bug in his ear telling him that speed her up. We got to get out of here now. 10 seconds now, 5 seconds, and commercial television is the worst. Public television is a lot better. They give you a little bit of time to, they generally have longer segments, and they give you a little more time to explain things. They're not as rushed in the general tone, and they're not just kind of doing that sort of fast-paced thing that science is not necessarily well suited to. Commercial radio is probably next in line because radio is a bit more leisurely than television is. You generally have longer segments than you do even in public radio or public television. And the best thing is public radio. We do love our NPR and the BBC. So anyway, here we go. So what Martin wanted to do is a 3-hour program on the creation and evolution controversy. And his idea was that he would interview a bunch of creationists who would attack evolution, which is what they do. And then I would tell why their arguments are bad. Now, this is a really, really bad show for my group. We can talk, I can bore you for hours about why scientists should not debate creationists or climate change deniers or whatever. There's lots and lots of reasons, not having to do with the weakness of our position, but the fact that the format of a formal debate is just wrong for science, and there's a lot of other subsidiary reasons for that. So the last thing I wanted to do is be the but defender of evolutionary biology. That was a non-starter for me. But this is what he wanted to do. That was his goal. So what I wanted to do is kind of steer him away from that into something that would be more likely to achieve my goals, which is a better public understanding of science, a more accurate understanding of the creation and evolution controversy, and so on. So what I pitched to him was a different idea. I said, well, that creation versus evolution has been done a zillion times. And there's so many programs on, creation and, creationist attacks upon evolution. I said, why don't you change it up a little bit? Do something new, do something different that hasn't been done very much before. And that is talk to people about religious views. Let's interview a bunch of scientists about their religious views. Let's interview some theologians about their views on evolution. Let's just look at this from a completely different standpoint. Okay, now, the reason why that was so clever is that, press generally like to do new stuff, okay? Or they like to take a new approach to an old topic, but they don't want to do the same old. And if you tell them that, God, that's been done 49 times already since June, you have a better chance. You're appealing to their values. You're going to get easier. And then I also pitched a very doable kind of project. And a project that his listeners and his editor, which is perhaps the most important thing, he's got to sell it to his editor, that his editor would find of interest because it would get ears on the program. So I appealed to his values while satisfying my goals, so to speak. And the good news is that this was very successful. He changed the whole tenor of his approach. He ended up doing this, what I thought was a very interesting program, 2 hours, but that was enough, where he and I traveled around the country. I was interviewing scientists and theologians and crazy Ken Ham. Boy, that was a fascinating that was really, really an interesting thing. But I was interviewing Ken Ham about his religious views, not about science, because Ken Ham doesn't know crap about science. Why would I interview Ken Ham about science? He's just going to confuse people listening to it. But I got him on camera to admit all of these really, really very, very conservative Christian views, which frankly any Catholic listening to would say, no, that's creationism? No, I don't believe in that. Any, Episcopalian and most Methodists and most Presbyterians, most mainstream Protestants would be listening and saying, whoa, 6 24-hour days? Nah, come on, you can't really believe that. Do they believe that? That was the interview I wanted. So I traveled around interviewing scientists about their religious views and theologians about their scientific views. Meanwhile, Henry Morris III, who is the son of probably the most important creationist of the 20th century, Henry Morris II, Henry III traveled around with Martin, interviewing kind of the same assortment of people, but more on the conservative side of the spectrum, but about religion, okay? So the show wasn't about the weaknesses of evolution, which is how all of those creation and evolution stories that are done from the science side of things end up being portrayed to the public. That didn't accomplish my goals. What did happen was the people who listened to that show found scientists saying, "Oh yes, I'm a person of faith, and yes, I accept evolution, and that works out fine with my religion." Theologians who were saying, "Oh yes, I teach theology at such and such, and I do this and that." And oh yes, evolution is a really inspiring aspect. Science is a really inspiring aspect in helping me deepen my faith and understand. It's just great because it showed there is this huge variation out there, rather than what the creationists want, which is a strict dichotomy. You're either a good guy creationist or you're a bad guy evolutionist. But instead of a dichotomy, there's this whole continuum of religious views out there, which certainly was a much more helpful kind of project than having more people leave listening to a program concluding, "Gee, I didn't know evolution was in such trouble." So, working with members of the press, respecting their values, respecting their independence, but pitching a story or an approach that achieves their goals is likely to achieve yours as well. But keep in mind what they're looking for as well. Accuracy. Well, it's obvious why accuracy is a very important value in journalism. As we've seen in the last 12 months, the confidence of the public can be seriously eroded when the validity of the stories, the fake news meme, when people believe that reporters just make things up. Jason Blair did make things up. Most reporters don't. Now, reporters can be wrong. Reporters can be wrong as a matter of ignorance, but ignorance is curable. Remember that. And one should not conclude that just because a reporter makes a mistake that this person has done something venal. It's perfectly okay to correct a reporter's error. But what I would strongly encourage you to do is to think a little bit about basic human psychology. When you criticize somebody, the tendency is for any of us is to sort of dig in your heels and push back. You're much more likely to achieve your goal, which is to get this reporter educated as to what the real science is, so that the next time she writes about this particular topic, she gets it right rather than confusing the public. That's your goal. Your goal is to educate this reporter and get her to change how she deals with this topic in the future. Make sense? Your goal is not to make yourself look good, all right? So what I'm strongly encouraging you to not do is reply in the comment section on the internet. Okay? I'm sorry you made a mistake. The anti-vax movement is not a predominantly liberal thing, and here's the sources for why that's so. Because that embarrasses the person and makes that person more likely to push back and makes it less likely for that person to actually absorb that information and change their ways, which is your goal. Okay? What you want to do is send that person a personal message, a personal email, or even just write them a letter, send them a fax, whatever. Make it personal, make it private. And start out by saying, "I really liked your article on such and such." Find something in there that you like, all right? This is just basic human psychology. Being nice to each other, okay? "I liked what you said about X. Oh, and by the way, when you mentioned that the anti-vax movement is predominantly a liberal plot, that's actually not true. Here are some studies that were done that you might like to take a look at before the next time you talk about the subject." That works.
Yeah, that's straight out of How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Yeah, exactly. And why? Who wrote that again? Dale Carnegie. Yeah. Who also said that the sound of a person's name is the best thing.
Yes.
Is music to their ears, which we were lamenting earlier how both of us are really crappy at remembering names. But yes, Dale Carnegie. All right. So, remember your goals and what's the best way to achieve that goal. Your goal is to improve the knowledge and treatment of that topic by this reporter. The best way to achieve that is to do it privately rather than publicly, because it's not about you. It's about achieving your goals. Narrative is another value of the press. Now, the idea of narrative, kind of gets kicked around by some scientists. We should just be able to present the science and not have to fancy it up by telling a story. And, there are scientists who just get all crabby about things like that. And I really think that they ought to sit back and think a little harder, frankly. How are we doing on time?
It is currently time to
make okay. Let me finish this thought and then we'll take a little trip.
Sounds great.
I recommend to you Randy Olson's work. He's the guy who wrote Don't Be Such a Scientist. He also wrote Flock of Dodos, which is about the creationism issue, which is a very funny book. But Don't Be Such a Scientist is about scientists communicating and how poorly they do it. His most recent book is Houston, We Have a Narrative. And if you can, Randy and his team also have really interesting workshops that they do for scientists on how to communicate better. ScienceNeedsStory.com didn't wrap very well there, but check out his website, ScienceNeedsStory.com. If you can get into one of these workshops, if he's doing one nearby and you can provide somebody to pay for it, I would suggest that this is a very useful way to spend your time. Okay, we were talking about narrative. Narrative has to do with telling stories. And frankly, we social primates learn through narrative. This is the best way for us to learn. And there have been lots and lots of actual research to demonstrate that when you teach somebody something or communicate information to somebody through a narrative, it sticks a lot longer, it's learned more fully, it's learned more quickly. There's a lot of different kinds of stories that one can tell. There are some very common narratives that you run into in science journalism. One is the journey or the quest. There's the triumph over adversity. There's, of course, conflict. Lets you and him fight. Have you ever seen John Wayne looking so young? It's an amazing picture, but anyway. The conflict narrative is a particularly worrisome one because it's the easiest. And there's, reporters are just like all the rest of us. Sometimes they get busy, they're going to take the easy way out. And a conflict narrative is something that's the easiest kind to write, because generally you can always find a conflict. And it also happens to have a lot of attraction for readers. So there's a real tendency to push for the conflict narrative. Telling stories is what a good journalist does. And I'm going to use evolution as my example, but pick the scientific topic of your choice. I tend to use evolution a lot because that's what I did for 26 years. The hero narrative is one that you run into a lot of in science journalism. The Australopithecine ventures into the savannah, learns to make tools, learns to hunt, and overcomes obstacles of being the saber-tooth's dinner. You look in the upper right-hand corner, there's this rather large cat that's going to come down and freak everybody out pretty quickly. So you have an awful lot of the journey quest in the coverage of evolution. Conflict is a particularly popular theme. Not just evolution, by the way. Highlighting the personal differences and backbiting that takes place among paleoanthropology seems to be a quite common sport. The epic struggles between Johansen and Leakey, Stephen Jay Gould, and just about everybody, they seem to focus on them disproportionately. Michael Crichton's latest posthumous book, which I'm going to read, hey, whatever, Dragon Teeth, is a fictionalized version of the Marsh and Cope bone wars or paleontology wars of the late 1800s. Well, if you don't know about Othaniel Marsh, and David Drinker Cope. This was one of the fights of the ages. These were two, let's see, Yale and Harvard, I think they were. These were two late 18th century or 19th century paleontologists who both worked in the American West, Wyoming, Montana, digging up dinosaurs and these big, which was a big deal back in the late 1800s. And I mean, these guys went at it hammer and tongs. They would sabotage each other's sites, not sight and visual sight, but the archaeological, the paleontological sites that people would work in. They'd hide fake fossils and then call them on it, and their graduate students would literally pull guns on each other. I mean, if you think the fights among scientists today, they can't hold a candle to those guys back in the late 1800s. But anyway, rivalry between scientists is a very popular meme. The conflict narrative is one that you're going to run into a lot. If this is not what you really want to stress in your interview with a member of the press, try to steer it to a more profitable approach. But just be aware of the fact that conflict narratives are very attractive to the press, and they will often try to pull them. I'll give you an example of a conflict narrative that went very, very bad. Here's an example of a very bad way to use conflict. Conflict can be a very useful literary and journalistic device, but this was a really bad example, at least from the standpoint of we scientists. January 24, 2009, New Scientist. The cover, Darwin was wrong. Cutting down the tree of life. Actually, if you looked at the article on the inside, the article was a science writer named Graham Lawton. The article was pretty good. What he was talking about is horizontal gene transfer. Remember your high school or college biology, the three domains of life: bacteria, eukarya, archaea. You are here. We are on the eukaryote branch. Eukaryotes are the ones that have chromosomes within a nucleus. I mean, all of these differences are really tiny. But basically, the vast majority of living things are single cells, okay, like bacteria, archaea, and even most of the eukaryotes. And horizontal gene transfer is this really interesting phenomenon in evolutionary biology, where at that bacteria, archaea, single-celled organism level, there's a lot of swapping around of stuff. And what that means is that it's very difficult to look at these three main domains of life and come up with what's abbreviated as LUCA, the last universal common ancestor, LUCA. When you've got horizontal gene transfer, it makes it really hard. What are the characteristics of the last common ancestor? Well, since bacteria have swapped some genes with archaea, archaea have swapped some genes with bacteria, they've swapped genes with eukaryotes, it's really hard to kind of tease out. This has got nothing to do with chopping down the tree of life whatsoever. As Evan Doolittle, who is the person whose work was being discussed here, pointed out, once you get eukaryotes, you got a tree, okay? Once you get a eukaryote multicellularity, notice that it looks very tree-like thereafter. You get very, very little horizontal gene transfer after you get past this single-celled organisms stuff. So the idea that Lawton's article about horizontal gene transfer somehow chopped down the tree of life is a bunch of horse poop. And the idea that Darwin was wrong is particularly egregious because, of course, Darwin didn't know squat about genetics at all, much less about archaea and bacteria and horizontal gene transfer. I mean, this whole thing, Darwin was wrong, cutting down the tree of life, is just really, really offensive. But, yeah.
So one thing I noticed here is, Darwin's just a famous person, loosely, he's the first person that you would have that's kind of related. Like, most people would know Darwin, that's you almost can't even
Darwin
quite
is
blame them for, you understand why they chose that name to put it on the headline.
Except that it's wrong.
Yes,
Nobody's
exactly.
wrong.
But
if you wanted to say, finding the common ancestor just got harder, that would be accurate.
Right.
But nothing on that cover is accurate. Yeah,
yes.
I can, you know.
No. My point was it's something I see in AI a lot. With everyone wants to quote Elon Musk, right? And he's a smart dude, but
He's not the
he's not the person you should be going to for a source.
Is he like related to AI or something?
I mean, he talks about it, and he does fund I'm doing an internship at a company that he funds now.
That's cool.
And so he's involved in it, and he knows more than your average person. But you know, there are actual people that think about this stuff
And
for
you
a
know,
living.
and you know that is an absolutely perfect example of why you shouldn't refer to evolution as Darwinism.
Mm.
You know, that's another little hobby horse that I get on at frequent interviews. That if you're going to talk about evolutionary biology, talk about evolutionary biology or just evolution. Don't call it Darwinism. Darwin was this very, very brilliant scientist who lived 200 years ago. All right, and he did a lot of stuff, and most of it is still good. But what have you done for us lately? You know, evolutionary biology today is so far beyond what Darwin understood. You know, this is, you know, I sometimes if I'm doing a thing with professors or teachers, I'll say, you know, are there any Darwinists here? And of course, everybody raises their hand. We're all Darwinists, of course. So, are there any Calvinists here? Any Lyellists here? And of course, they go, well, you know, no. Physicists don't refer to themselves as Calvinists any more than evolutionary biologists refer to themselves as Darwinists. You know, why would or geologists refer to themselves as Lyellists? You know, why would you refer to yourself? Why would you reference a 19th century scientist from your field as your identification? Duh. We've gone a little bit past Kelvin, I assume, in physics? Okay, so you're not Kelvinist, we're not Darwinists. Unfortunately, this was not just offensive to scientists. Bad science journalism has consequences. At the Texas Board of Education meeting, just a couple of days after that New Scientist article came out online, the creationist school board members were already citing the article as evidence for why the strengths and weaknesses of evolution should be in the textbooks, and why the Texas Proclamation, which is the equivalent of the science framework there, the document that directs what textbooks should have in their chapters, should have the weaknesses of evolution, because here's the new scientist that says that Darwin was wrong, right? The Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Jerry Coyne, and P.Z. Myers, who are all well-known biologists, wrote an open letter to the editor of New Scientist, Roger Highfield, saying, "You have made a lot of extra unpleasant work for the scientists whose work you should be explaining to the general public. We all now have to try to correct all the misapprehensions your cover has engendered." I mean, they properly took him to the woodshed. It was a really stupid thing. And then Highfield, showing total cluelessness about, you know, what science communication is all about, defended himself by pointing out that creationists, he said, but inside the issue, I have an editorial in which I say that creationists are likely to take this out of context, so I'm okay. What is wrong with this picture? What is wrong with this picture is that lots of people will see the cover of the magazine on the newsstand or someplace. Darwin was wrong. Oh, I didn't know evolution was in such big trouble. They're not going to open it up and see that Highfield's saying, creationists, you should not take this as any evidence that Darwin was wrong. Well, then why did you put it on the cover? So this just drove me crazy. And so after, lots of scientists jumped on and including me. It was very strange, actually. I was going to a talk that I'd give in North Carolina someplace, and I got this phone call on my cell phone, and so it was from London, so I pulled over and hello, and it was Roger Highfield. I'd never met him before in my life, but somebody had said, you really should talk to Eugenie Scott about this because this is going to blow up. And I very gently told him why this was a really, really bad thing that he had done, and that this cover was completely irresponsible. It was going to cause us a lot of problems with the creationists. Then, of course, a couple of weeks later, naturally in Texas, we found that out in spades. He basically used the used the telephone call with me to try to defend himself rather than to actually learn why he was wrong, which was very disappointing. So lots of scientists took him to the woodshed. Teachers, he got a lot of really negative pushback. But adding insult to injury, even after all of that pushback from scientists, he then approved this advertisement for why you should subscribe to New Scientist by using that cover again, giving it yet more publicity. This was very annoying. All right, so this is not how to do good science journalism, right? Is there a way to have a flashy cover that'll get people to buy your magazine? Yes, and I understand the whole purpose of having a magazine, of having a blog, of having a whatever, social media, anything else, is to get eyeballs on it, is to get people to buy it, is to generate income. It's a business. That's fine. I have no problem. But do it in a way that has integrity. National Geographic had this cover a few years ago, and on the inside was this article. Okay. Notice the difference. The cover says, "Was Darwin wrong?" ? Well, that's a very interesting question. Let's take a look and see on page 46. Let's take a look and see, was Darwin wrong? No, it says in 75-point type. There's a big difference between stating Darwin was wrong and asking a question, was Darwin wrong? Both of them are going to sell magazines, okay? But one of them has integrity. Okay, let's talk about balance. Narrative and the need for conflict obviously can skew the accuracy of the reportage, and with sometimes negative effects on the public's understanding an issue, but balance is maybe the most difficult issue that we as scientists encounter in American journalism. It's a very important issue. Well, it's actually becoming less important, unfortunately. But traditionally, American journalism has really stressed that you don't want to be one-sided. You want to let both sides speak. You want to have information on both. And actually, that's really good. If you go to France or Italy, you have to buy 4 newspapers in order to find out what's going on, because from newspaper A you will get the very hard right position. From newspaper B you'll get the center left position. You don't have a single newspaper that says these people say this and these people say that. So balance on the one hand, on the other hand, hence the picture, is actually not a bad thing. I'm not criticizing balance, but I want to know. I want to know what Trump's position is on immigration. I want to know what the Democrats' position is on immigration. Now, this is important for us to get both sides of controversial issues. Science is a little different, okay? Because balance works a little bit differently. It's perfectly appropriate for a science journalist to say, here are 2 scientists who are debating over this subject matter. Scientist A says this, scientist B says this. It's also extremely useful and important if appropriate, if the journalist maybe adds some contextual information. But scientist B has, it has been noted that scientist B has been supported by industry X, Y, and Z, and scientist A is associated with the University of X, Y, and Z. It's useful to have some contextual information in these stories, because there are legitimate scientific disputes, and you want to, as somebody who's trying to learn about science, you want to know what the different positions are. String theory pro, string theory con. That's all I know about string theory, is that people are arguing about it. That's fine. But there are a lot of things in science which actually are pretty well agreed upon, I don't think we're going to have any major changes in the astronomical position of whether the Earth goes around the Sun or the Sun goes around the Earth. That's a keeper. Okay. We don't need to have geocentric and heliocentric on the one end. On the other end, nobody would think that would be a sensible way to write an article on astronomy. Well, the idea that all of us living creatures have common ancestors, which is what evolution is. The idea of common ancestry is here to stay. I mean, every single bit of information we have allows the inference that all living things have common ancestors. Journalists really should reflect that in their coverage of a scientific issue. If one side is spouting nonsense, you know, HIV causes AIDS, HIV doesn't cause AIDS, you know, there's no need to give coverage to the side that is nonsense. In its worst form, balance can generate into what's called squirrel journalism. You have a nut on one side and a nut on the other side. There's a cynical saying of lawyers about expert witnesses. And unfortunately, this reflects too often what happens in the press coverage of science stories as well. Here is Richard Dawkins, famous evolutionary biologist. There is Michael Behe, intelligent design proponents. Richard says this, Michael says that. They are presented as if they are equally weighted. Unfortunately, that's not quite the case, because if you look at the number of people over here on the evolutionary biology side, it is highly disproportionate to the number of scientists supporting the intelligent design side. Fortunately, journalism has changed in the last, since the 90s approximately. We used to have a lot of problems in the 90s because journalists reporting on a new fossil discovery would feel that for the purpose of balance they had to go out and find a creationist to say something about it, you know, and which just drove us nuts. But you know, through working with organizations like the National Science Writers Association, and just also the science writers themselves kind of having their consciousnesses raised about what are the best ways to deal with topics like this, and how, no, you don't have to give balance when the opposing point of view has no scientific validity to it. Things have improved a great deal. You don't find journalists checking with creationists these days when they're reporting some new finding. This, I think, I have to show this to you. This is such a great segment, making that same point.
The Earth. You may know it as that blue thing.
I'm going to move this up a little bit. I think I'm moving this up a little bit.
In Bruce Willis is always trying to save. Or from its famous collaboration with wind and fire. Or just simply as that place where George Clooney lives. Anyway, the Earth had some genuinely bad news this week.
A White House report that says global warming threatens every part of the U.S.
This isn't something in the distant future. Climate change is already affecting us now.
Now. Smart move, Obama. That is a key shift in how to talk about climate change, because we've all proven that we cannot be trusted with the future tense. We've been repeatedly asked, don't you want to leave a better Earth for your grandchildren? And we've all collectively responded, fuck 'em. But incredibly, this latest damning scientific report may still face an uphill climb with science.
There's that Gallup poll that came out last month, which found 1 in 4 Americans is skeptical of all the effects of climate change and thinks this issue's been exaggerated.
Who gives a shit? That doesn't matter. You don't need people's opinions on a fact. You might as well have a poll asking which number is bigger, 15 or 5? Or do owls exist? Or are there hats? The debate on climate change should not be whether or not it exists, it's what we should do about it. There is a mountain of research on this topic. Global temperatures are rising. Heat waves are becoming more common, sea surface temperatures are also rising, glaciers are melting, and of course no climate report is complete without the obligatory photo of a polar bear balancing on a piece of ice. The only accurate way to report that 1 out of 4 Americans are skeptical of global warming is to say, a poll finds that 1 out of 4 Americans are wrong about something. Because a survey of thousands of scientific papers that took a position on climate change found that 97% endorsed the position that humans are causing global warming. And I think I know why people still think this issue is open to debate, because on TV it is. And it's always one person for, one person against. And it's usually the same person for.
Bill Nye and Marsha Blackburn, welcome both of you to Meet the Press.
Bill Nye joins us now, along with climate change skeptic Mark Morano.
Joining me now to go head-to-head, Bill Nye, science educator and CEO of the Planetary Society.
In the crossfire, Bill Nye, the science guy.
Bill Nye, the science guy, who believes in man-made global warming.
Yeah, that's right. More often than not, it's Bill Nye, the science guy, versus some dude. And when you look at the screen, it's 50-50, which is inherently misleading. If there has to be a debate about the reality of climate change, and there doesn't, then there is only one mathematically fair way to do it.
Last Week Tonight presents a statistically representative climate change debate.
Good evening. Joining me tonight, a climate change denier and, naturally, Bill Nye Science Guy.
Humans are causing climate change? No question.
Wait. Before we begin, in the interest of mathematical balance, I'm going to bring out two people who agree with you, climate skeptic, and Bill Nye, I'm also going to bring out 96 other scientists. It's a little unwieldy, but this is the only way you can actually have a representative discussion. Please file in. Again, this is going to make the debate difficult. We shouldn't really be having it in the first place. But, representationally, climate skeptic, please make a case against climate change.
Well, I just don't think all the science is in yet. It's settled.
Okay, and what is the overwhelming view of the entire scientific community? Any response to that? Any response? I can't hear you over the weight of scientific evidence. This whole debate should not have happened.
That is brilliant science communication. The same point that I just made with the little slide with showing all the scientists showing up on on the evolution side versus the one lonely guy over on the other side. This came out. I've been using that little slide for decades, and I always change the scientists in it depending on where I am. I always end up with the person who's hosting me, and everybody laughs. But this was such a great visual, because just like my little 2-cent slide, 100 people in white lab coats versus these three. I mean, it was just really brilliant. So we'll finish this off.
I apologise to everyone at home. My thanks to Bill Nye and the overwhelming scientific consensus.
All right.
Jeannie?
Yes.
Can I ask a question? So, your support of that skip there seems to me to contradict a lot of stuff that we've talked about here, which is so there were sort of two approaches there. One approach was let's throw out some facts, global temperatures are rising, ice is melting, blah blah blah. That is the science deficit model. Okay, so that part doesn't work. So then let's try this other thing, which is to argue from authority and look at the consensus, and then have a bunch of people screaming at folks who are just gonna dig in their heels, right? So I truthfully don't understand. That's effective if you already agree with them.
This is not a persuasive video.
Okay.
I totally agree with you.
Okay.
Yeah. This and thank you.
So
for
how is it science
nicely outlining
then?
why they aren't?
Yeah.
But it's great science communication. Well, for people who are. I was trying to roll forward to just show the little clip where they have the 3 climate change deniers and then the 97 climate scientists in their white coats, because the point that underscores is the point that it's not one against one. It's a tiny minority of people against the vast scientific consensus. That can be turned into an argument from authority, which is not necessarily always bad, actually. If your doctor tells you that you need to have your appendix out, you're probably going to go along with it, even if it's an argument from authority. Expertise does count for some things. But I wanted to show that just because it was such a great, illustration of that point, that it's not a one-to-one type of thing. But yeah, I mean, the rest of the skit, and of course it's a skit. It's television. You have to be visual. I find John Oliver very entertaining. I think he uses, his little, are there owls? He's got these little funny things. I'm not sure how many people are persuaded by him. I used to often get people saying, well, you're out there talking to the GSA, or you're out there talking to AAAS. You're just talking to the people. You're just preaching to the choir. My response to that was yes, because the choir needs ammo. People who are on your side of an issue need to know the information that will make them more persuasive. So never worry about preaching to the converted. The choir needs ammo. Let me zip through the rest of this real quickly, because we were supposed to quit at 4, and I've been droning a lot, and we should really have some time to talk. Okay, you need to be careful about narrative and balance. It's not that narrative and balance are bad, but they can go bad in the wrong hands. But if you're going to deal effectively with the press, you have to appreciate why narrative and balance are so very important to them. Okay, a couple of other things to keep in mind. In general, if you're going to be talking to the public, you have to kind of realize that your orientation, your natural way of communicating is going to be different from theirs. As a scientist, when we talk about science, we start with the background, that's your materials and methods, and that's your literature review. You talk about the background, you get into the supporting details, and then at the end you have the conclusion. Well, that's not exactly how it works in the big world. The general public wants to know the bottom line. What's your conclusions? And then they want to know, why is this important to me? Well, so what? Why should I care? And then only later, if you've got time, to get into the supporting details. When you're dealing with a reporter, the red triangle is what you need to be thinking about. The reporter possibly has time to hear you go into all the background information, the review of literature and everything else, but probably not. And if you give the conclusion and why this is important, and then if you've got time, you can go into the other stuff. A general point to keep in mind, again, is that whatever your audience is, particularly when it's a public audience, what they hear is more important than what you say. If you've ever done any teaching, if you've been a TA or anything like that, you know this is really true. Because what they hear is often something very different from what you thought you said. You think you're transmitting information, but it comes back very like a telephone, like a game of telephone. It comes back very differently than how it was put out. And you can't really blame sometimes you can blame the students for that. It's useful to be able to blame the students, but if you're dealing with a reporter, this is on you. If a reporter doesn't get the story right, that's your fault. That's just the way it works. So you really have to think very hard about how you are communicating. Most of the kind of science communication that you'll have with a journalist will be what we call at NCSE drive-by science, which is why I called this talk drive-by science. You got one shot, and then you go away. When I was, when I go around the country, if I give a talk at a university or a talk for a civic group or something like that, I've got 1 hour, I say my thing, and then I pack my bags and I leave. And it's the teachers and the professors who kind of have to mop up after me. But whatever I said is whatever I said. I can't come back and say, no, you didn't understand that. So I have to be extremely careful with what I say and how I say it, and try to be organized, and so that I don't, in my drive-by science, leave people with lots of unanswered questions. Well, what determines what the audience hears? Well, obviously, the amount of background that the audience has in your subject matter. If you're talking to biochemists about biochemistry, you can go into a lot more depth. If you're talking to biochemists about human evolution, start at the beginning, because they really don't know anything about human evolution. So the background of your audience is certainly something that's very important to keep in mind. But it's also the case that your audience is very likely to hear things differently than how you meant them. So I want to talk about watching your language. All right, and obviously I'm not talking about jargon, because you know enough to leave jargon out, but sometimes it's not really a matter of jargon so much as it is a matter of people hearing something very different from what you said, because you have in your mind a term of art, science definition of a word, but it's not heard that way at all. Tucker, I think I left the door ajar. Would you mind shutting the door, just to make sure? I mean, it's not very likely that somebody's going to be wandering
The door
around.
downstairs
No,
or here?
here,
Okay.
right here in the front. And I'm assuming none of you are creationists, okay? Because there's some things you just don't want to get out, because it could be very, very detrimental to my professional reputation, shall we say. How many of you believe in evolution? Okay, that makes me feel better. Okay, because I'm afraid to have to tell you that I do not believe in evolution. So it's a good thing to shut the door. We don't want any creationists reporting this on their blogs the next day. I'll tell you what I don't believe in. I don't believe in thermodynamics, heliocentrism, plate tectonics, cell division, atoms, or the kinetic theory of matter. I'll tell you what I do believe in. I believe in free speech, separation of church and state, taking steps to curb global warming. I believe that Haley is not a shithole, and that my husband is the smartest, funniest, and best looking man that I know. All right, now, what is the difference between these two columns? Just in the matter of speed, these are opinions. These are not opinions. It is not an opinion whether the earth goes around the sun or the sun goes around the earth. It is an opinion whether church and state should be separate. Making this distinction is extremely important. If you use the word believe, you are communicating that this is an opinion. Okay? Well, I believe in it. I never say I believe in evolution. I say I accept evolution. You don't say that you believe in thermodynamics. Okay? So don't say you believe in evolution either. And there's a lot of little funny linguistic things like this that you want to, like I said, most of my examples are from evolution because that's what I did for a living for a long time. But there's, we accept explanations in science because we have evidence for them, not because we believe in them, okay? And also the word belief has religious connotations, and we also want to try to keep that out of science as well. We want to focus on evidence and why and the process of science that gave us these explanations. Susan Hassel and Richard Somerville pointed out that scientists who are talking about climate change may use terminology quite differently than non-scientists. Now we could talk about a positive trend in flu cases. What? What's positive about more people getting the flu? Are you nuts? They suggest using an upward trend in flu cases. Okay? Positive trend is a perfectly reasonable statistical phrase. But what the public hears is positive, a good trend. You think it's good that more people are getting the flu? Come on, get it. Similarly, temperature goes up, the permafrost thaws, carbon dioxide and methane are released into the atmosphere. This is a positive feedback system. Not very positive. This is a really bad thing, because we're all going to hell in a handbasket here. They suggest using the term vicious cycle rather than positive feedback, or if you don't want to be quite so pejorative, a self-reinforcing cycle. In an article that they wrote, which is in Physics Today, October 2011, in the fine print there, they have a number of terms that when the public hears them, they put a different connotation to them than what we mean. We talk about enhancing. The public believes that means improving something, but we're really talking about intensifying or increasing something. Very good example of uncertainty. Well, uncertainty isn't that bad in science. I mean, uncertainty is a statistical component, and it's very important to know what is the uncertainty. The public hears ignorance. All right? So you have to think about how these terms that we use in science, they're not jargon necessarily, but they're terms that we use in a special way in science. They are terms of art. Here's a term of art. Which one of these is a person? You can say me.
Yeah.
However, if we were in a court of law, General Motors is a person. Okay. In a court of law, institutions like General Motors are persons, not people. They're persons. And because of a developing fetus is not a person. Okay? Terms of art. Person is a term of art in law. Theory is a term of art in science. Now, most people hear the word theory and they immediately think guess or hunch or something that you don't really accept. It's funny how in America we use the word theory very selectively. Nobody talks about the theory of thermodynamics. Nobody talks about the theories of cell division. There's lots of, science is all about theory. That's what we do. We die happy if we come up with a theory. Now, that's all, that's the goal of science. Theories are inferential explanations, but the public doesn't understand that. If you're doing drive-by science, if you've only got one shot at somebody or an audience or a reporter, as opposed to having 10 weeks as a TA or something as a teacher, if you've got one shot at somebody, don't use the T word. Okay? I can go for weeks without saying the word theory. I talk about explanations. Well, evolution is a very good explanation for explaining the diversity of birds or something. Okay? You can live a long and happy life without ever talking about theories. And because once you say theory, immediately what the public hears is, oh, this is something that you don't really have to pay attention because that's your theory buster. Theories are something that you don't have to take seriously. Another word that you should avoid in the context of science is mystery, as in the origin of life is a mystery. Because you will say things like X is a mystery in the context of something that is yet unsolved. What the public hears is unsolvable. Okay? The origin of life is a mystery is heard as we'll never understand the origin of life.
Is there anything to be said for, or any kinds of strategies that you could suggest wherein you kind of in your explanation of whatever scientific phenomenon you're talking about, use words that they usually, are we allowed to claim the language? It makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable to think that I shouldn't use the word theory just because someone might misunderstand me. Maybe I could use it and explain it. And in science, that means that, or when I say it's a mystery, I mean that I fully believe that there's an explanation, we just don't know what it is yet. So when scientists use the word, it feels like, in the chart that you showed of all the things, it feels like science should be ideally would be bleeding into the general population, the general
sure.
parlance.
If you've got lots of opportunity to come back to the same audience, fine. If it's a 10-week semester and you can just hammer away, I tell teachers and professors never use the word theory unless you use it 4 times a day. Use it in every single lecture and talk about the theory of this, the theory of that. Just totally saturate your students with what theory really means. Because it's very easy for them, dollars to donuts, they're just going to flip back to their old understanding after the exam is over.
I guess I felt sort of the same way though about the 2 triangles, the opposing triangles, because I sort of feel like the best science communication can be concise, it can be to the point, all this kind of stuff, but you kind of build, you don't have to say this is what's I think this is what's true, here's the soundbite or something. You could say so we had this question and then we worked through it by this process of investigation and then we found out, via someone, and sort of save the finding in a little bit,
depends on how much
show the
time
process
you
or something.
Yeah, I think
all depends on the amount of time.
You have 1 minute to explain what you have to do. But you've been using the phrase drive-by science, and I've been interpreting that as the absolute shortest amount of time possible. Literally, there's no time for a misplaced word. So at what point is it no longer drive-by?
That's your call.
Or how do you? Yeah, it seems it almost seems like a values or it makes me uncomfortable to just say this is the truth, to just stand up and tell people this is the truth and you should listen to me because I'm a scientist. That just feels
that's why I
wrong.
mentioned that hierarchy.
Yeah.
The worst kinds of programs for all of us to be on is commercial television, which has the biggest reach. If you get a chance to go on commercial television, do it, because you'll reach more people than anything you'll ever write in your professional literature for the rest of your life. All of the articles that you've ever written as a professional scientist, that I've ever written as a professional scientist, all of the people who have read them will not equal half of one audience that sees me on television. That's the truth of the situation. But that's where you've got to start with your conclusion and you know, whatever time you have to back it up, that's great. But if you start off droning about how you got, I mean, I am passionate about helping people understand the nature of science. We don't just, you know, pull these ideas out of our heads. There's a process that's followed to get it. And the more I can work that in, the more I will. But especially on, you know, the difference between commercial television and NPR is how much you can really support your points of view. And I think avoiding language that's going to be misunderstood from the get-go is something really worth thinking about. It'd be lovely to recapture the word theory, but what counts is what do they understand? They understand the word explanation, and that's what theories are. You know? If you've got time to really explain the difference between theory and law, and theories do not grow up to be laws. Laws are explained by theories. Theories are the big deal, but nobody cares about that.
I think
theories
what
are
counts
guesses.
is what they understand. Is like a good.
That's right. What is your audience? What is your audience, and what's in the, you know, they're not tabula rasas. Your audience comes to you with a context of, you know, of language and culture and social groupings and everything like that, and a huge variation on how much they already understand about science. Nobody said, you know, nobody promised you a rose garden in science communication.
To come back to mystery, I would, like, if I take my science hat off and be just a person, I would think, like, I would associate the word murder with mystery, but that sounds like a solvable thing in my non-scientific hat, even. Like,
yeah, it's going to be heard differently by different people. Many people will hear it, though, as unsolvable, because that's what mysteries are, you know, especially if you come from a religious context, because religious, you know, Christians are always talking about mysteries, you know, and these are things that you don't bother asking about because you just accept them. They are mysteries. They will never be translated. Others will look at it, you know, I like your analogy of a murder, of a crime scene or something. This is a mystery, and it may be solvable. What I recommend, instead of using the word mystery, is say, we don't understand the origin of life. We don't understand X yet. Okay? And I would really encourage you to remember that adverb yet. Okay? Because what you're doing is planting in your listener's brain that this is something that, you know, in the future we might know. If you say it's a mystery, you don't plant that idea that this is something that's solvable. And you want people to have confidence. I want people to have confidence in science because I think science is really great. I think science can answer a whole lot of questions that we're interested in. All right, so for watching your language, roughly I talked about terms of art and science versus common use, belief in science, theory. Don't use the word mystery. There's a whole lot of other, don't use Darwinism as a synonym for evolution. There's lots and lots of other words, but we only have 2 hours together today, my friends, so I actually can't tell you everything I know about this subject. Hopefully I've chosen at least a few things that will be of interest and hopefully of use to you. And now we have a whole 7 minutes to talk if you want.